Hello, I'm Erica Williams, and in this video I'm going to show you how to make good, great and memorable starts and finishes to your presentations. By the end of this video, I hope that you can give a start and a finish to your presentation that is rounded, well prepared and leaves a really great impression. So getting off to a good start and making a good finish to your presentation is a little bit like drawing a circle. You start with your presentation, you have the start phase of the presentation, you go around the presentation with your material, and then you come to the end of the presentation and you want to make a good finish and a good conclusion with some strong messages that completes the circle. This makes your presentation feel well-rounded, well-prepared and managed. So with starts and finishes, there are conventions to the things that presenters say and do at the start and finish of a presentation. We're going to look at those conventions and then we'll go on to discuss a few techniques that you can also build into your start and finish to build in greater impact. So let's come to the start of the presentation. As we learned in the last video, if you haven't seen it already, about attention, we learned that presenters have a very good opportunity at the start of a presentation. It's most probable that the attention of the listeners is going to be very high and that they're going to maybe listen to every word of the start of your presentation. Research shows that the starts of presentations have a limited time. Depending on the overall length of your presentation, you should be aiming for something that's around 90 seconds to around about 3 minutes in length. If you go on too long, you will begin to lose your audience. Now, in that 3 minutes or 90 seconds, there are certain things that you need to do. And basically, what you need to do is answer certain questions for your listeners. There are certain things they need to know so they can listen to the rest of your presentation. So the first 3 questions are the who, why, what questions. So who is clearly some kind of introduction. And again, this will depend on the scenario for your presentation. If I'm giving a presentation and I'm talking to colleagues of mine who've known me for a number of years, I probably have to say very little or nothing about myself because the people already know me. If, on the other hand, you have to give a presentation to a new client, then you might have to say quite a lot about yourself, about your background, about your job and what you do in your job. The next thing you need to address is the question of why. And the why is about the purpose or the aim of your presentation. It's very important in your presentation that you decide what the final message of your presentation is going to be. This will make up part of the finish phase. But at the beginning of your presentation, you really need to express why you're giving the presentation. There can be many complex reasons. There can be hidden reasons like it's an assignment, you have to do the presentation, you want to leave a good impression. But you need to express as well at the beginning of the presentation the reason why you're giving the presentation. Linguistically, it's not difficult. The reason I'm here today to... You firmly state your why because you don't want to begin your presentations and the listeners are thinking, well, why is the presenter here and why am I listening to this? After you've done your why, then you need to give the different points that are coming up in your presentation. This will help again to give orientation and direction to your listeners. It will help them to begin to organize the ideas in your presentations in their brains. And again, this is not very difficult to do. You just say something like, in my first point, I'm going to do this. In the second topic, we're going to outline the possibilities for, and in the third point, we're going to look at the outlook for, something like this. It's a little bit like the equivalent of giving the agenda in a meeting. The other question you might want to address at the beginning of your presentation, again, depending on the scenario, is the how question. And there are certain things that listeners need to know so that they can listen again to the rest of your presentation. They may need to know if they need to take notes, when they can ask questions, or if they can ask questions. If you're working in a company or you're doing a longer presentation, your audience members might need to know if you're taking a break, when that break is, if there are refreshments, or even maybe where the bathrooms are in your company. Now, for example, I often give detailed handouts at the end of my presentations. So saying something like, you really don't need to take notes in this presentation. I will be giving you a full detailed handout at the end of the presentation, is very helpful to the audience members. I'd be very grateful if you could leave questions until the end of the presentation. Or an alternative is to take questions at the end of every point. So at the end of every topic in my presentation, I will take a handful of questions. So these are the conventions at the start of the presentation. So let's move on to the finish. What are the conventions at the finish? Well, the first thing I would do at the finish is give some kind of signal that you're at the end of the presentation. That's all I wanted to say about. That brings me to the end of the presentation, something like that. The second you do that, the attention of the audience will begin to kick in or to rise. Now, I would always, even if it was a short presentation of maybe 5 minutes, I would always give a summary to a presentation. I think there are many advantages to giving a summary. A summary is basically looking back at what you've said in the presentation. It's a reflection of the what that you gave at the beginning. And even if the presentation is short, you can say something very quickly like, so we've looked at topic 1, we've looked at this, and we've looked at this. I think there are advantages in this. It helps the listeners to come to gather their thoughts together. Maybe their attention is a little bit higher at the end of the presentation at this point, and they will hear something or maybe understand something that they didn't completely grasp during the body of the presentation. For me, it's a little bit like building a foundation, and you're building this solid brick foundation so that you can make the next point in your presentation, which is the take-home message. And giving this take-home message now is like building a house on the foundation that you've just made with the summary. And the take-home message is again, it's your final message of the presentation. It's whatever you want people to believe, think, or do after the presentation has finished. And this should be a very strong part of your presentation. You should be able to deliver it with complete belief and conviction and in a very strong way. And once you've made that message and you've given it impact, then there's just a few closing courtesies, a few closing words. So think something like, thank you very much for listening to my presentation. If you've got any questions, I'd be really happy to answer them. So these are the basics, these are the conventions, these are the things that I would always do in presentations at the start and the finish. The more that you do these things, the more they become very natural, and you'll find every time you get up to give a presentation, you will very naturally find the words to do these things. So what we can begin to look at here is the idea of building in more impact, and begin to look at some things, some techniques that you can use at the start and the finish of the presentation. And here I'm going to look at 4 different techniques. These are rhetorical questions, surprising facts and figures, quotations, and the use of pictures. So first of all, let's look at rhetorical questions. If you don't know what a rhetorical question is, it's basically a question that is given by the speaker, but they don't expect a verbal answer. These are really useful for presenters because the presenter normally goes on to answer the questions in the rhetorical question during the course of the presentation. It's a little bit like digging a hole, and then during the presentation you begin to fill in the hole that you've dug with a rhetorical question. Questions are always great because questions will get your audience thinking. If you're asked a question, then you begin to think about the answer to that question. But rhetorical questions are also great in presentations because they don't take up very much time. Always make sure your rhetorical questions are grammatically correct. Don't make them too long or too complex. Make your rhetorical question short and simple so that it's very clear what the issue is that you want your listeners to think about. If there's a problem with rhetorical questions, I would say sometimes I've met presenters and rhetorical questions seem to be the only technique that they know, and the use of rhetorical questions becomes too much in the presentation. You just get rhetorical questions, rhetorical questions, rhetorical questions. I think they're great. There are many advantages to using rhetorical questions, but I would limit their use, maybe 3 or 4 sprinkled through the presentation, or maybe just use them in the start phase of the presentation. And you can use them, for example, just even to give the what of the presentation. So what's in my first point? Then what are we going to move on to? Okay, let's move on to the second technique, statistics and facts, and using those in a more dramatic way. Now what I've done here is taken the subject of, say for example, I'm working for a food company, and I've taken the subject of healthy food and diet, and I've found this information. A normal healthy amount of food for an average person is about 1,800 to 2,600 calories a day. During a binging episode, it is not unusual for someone to eat 20 to 25 times that amount, which is more than 50,000 calories, which is roughly equivalent to an entire extra large pizza, a tub of ice cream, a package of cookies, a bag of potato chips, and an entire cake. Now this is quite dramatic information. You can use it to quite good effect in the start or the finish of your presentation. Now one thing that you can always use is dramatic numbers. And dramatic numbers work quite well if you just pull out the number and put the number on the screen. And this will certainly get impact. So if you say in a normal binging episode, a person will eat 50,000 calories in the binging episode. Another thing you could do here is take the statistics about what this is the equivalent to, and to simply use pictures here rather than just to use the words. So in the average binging episode, a person will eat 50,000 calories. This is equivalent to eating a large pizza, plus a whole tub of ice cream, plus a whole package of cookies, plus a whole bag of potato chips, and an entire cake. These are just some ideas for you to play around with. Let's have a look at quotations. I think quotations are really useful in presentations. People often use them at the beginning and the end. Sometimes people use the same quotation at the beginning and they repeat it again at the end, or they use part of the quotation at the beginning and they finish it at the end. Quotations are very useful because the presenter's doing a lot of speaking in the presentation, and they might be giving a lot of their own opinions and their own research and ideas. And quotations can really help to put another voice into the room of the presentation. As a presenter, you're not saying, well, it's just me that thinks this, but also Steve Jobs thinks this and Bill Gates said this. I'd like to give you an example. I've taken here the subject of climate change, and I've looked around and I found this quotation that I quite like. So the quotation is a Native American proverb, and it's, "We do not inherit the earth from our ancestors, we borrow it from our children." Why do I quite like this quotation? First of all, I think it's not too long. I think it's enough for an audience to quickly understand the message and the impact that I'm trying to get with this quotation. I also think there's some quite nice ideas in this quotation. There are ideas about past and present. So the ancestors are past and our children the future. There are also ideas here with opposites, for example, inherit and to borrow. Again, past and future. These are themes and ideas that you can build into the presentation and build up ideas and images throughout the presentation. I think this quotation is very useful for that. Another thing you could easily do with this quotation is to divide it into two parts. So you could take the first sentence in the beginning of the presentation, we do not inherit the earth from our ancestors. And in your take-home message, you could use the last part of the quotation, we borrow it from our children. A couple of tips here in using this in the presentation as well. When you use this on a slide and you put it on the screen, I would simplify it. You don't need to have the words. It's a Native American proverb on the slide. You can just say this. I would try and simplify the quotation as much as possible. I would always take out quotation marks. Quotation marks can work differently in different languages and they can be a little bit confusing, and it's information on the slide that you don't really need. I've simplified this so it just works on 2 lines, and I've highlighted words in the quotation that I think are really important and should be stressed, such as inherit, ancestors, borrow, and children. So this was quotations, and the last point that I would like to give you, or the last idea I would like to give you, is to think about using pictures with a dramatic effect in your presentation. Now here I've taken a different subject. The subject is health and safety at the company XYZ Limited, and I'm a health and safety officer in the company. Now I could just stick to the conventions of presenting. You know, my name is, I'm a health and safety officer at XYZ, and I'm here today to talk about health and safety at the company. And in my agenda or in my presentation, I'm going to talk about point 1, point 2, and point 3. This is effective. It's certainly okay. There could be a way of making this more dramatic and drawing in the attention of your listeners and maybe even raising that attention listening curve. So have a listen to this example. I work here as a health and safety officer at XYZ Limited, and we have this chemical factory in the middle of a city. And very often I'm sitting in my office and I look up and I look at the sky and I see the aeroplanes flying across the sky. And sometimes I get to thinking and I think, well, what if there was an accident with one of these aeroplanes and it dropped from the sky and it landed on this factory? What would the effects be? Well, I can tell you they would be dramatic, and it would look something like this. The effect would be something like a nuclear bomb going off in the middle of the city. A lot of property would be damaged and a lot of life would be lost. And this is why health and safety is really important in our company. So I'm here today to talk to you about this. And in my presentation, I'm going to talk about point 1, point 2, and point 3. So these were 4 brief ideas for you to think about and to get you thinking about giving that start and giving that finish impact and making it memorable. If you're giving an exam presentation, maybe your start and your finish will be the difference between you and other candidates for the exam. And at the end of the day, yours is the one presentation that is remembered by the examiners for all the good reasons. So in this video, we've seen that starts and finishes are important, that when you design your presentation, you should think of it as a circle and you should prepare it well and round off that circle, There are certain conventions for presentations at the start and the finish, and starts and finishes are an area where you can begin to use techniques and really give that start and finish some impact. Thank you very much for listening.